Carrie Cannon, Emily Floyd, and Ryan Jones to our panel discussion today. So we have already had a wonderful group conversation yesterday about these liminal spaces of deciding whether to stay or whether to go. And every one of us in this room has crossed that threshold at some point, or sometimes multiple times in the arc of our vocational journey. Today we look at another aspect of that, and that is when we do cross those thresholds, how do we say goodbye? And how do we say hello to new friends, church members, all of those kinds of things? Yesterday I asked for a show of hands of those who've moved in just the last 2 years, and it was a plurality, if not a majority, of hands that went up in the room. These are tender moments and holy moments, they can be. So just a word or two of introduction about leaving and about beginning again, and then I'm going to turn to our panelists. I want to say this about leaving a place. For some in this room, your leaving has been painful and unfair. And I just want to name that. Some of you were not given the opportunity to be acknowledged and to be blessed as you left the place. And I think it's important that we recognize that, and we all know colleagues who are in this room for whom that is true. For others of us, leaving is, well, more typical, even if you dusted off like the proverb, you dusted off your feet as you walk down the path away from the village. Either way, there are things to be gained in leaving well. We'll sort of hold that thought. And then what about beginning well? Beginning again. Starting in a new place, it's usually with such high hopes, right? And most of the time, you're welcomed with great fanfare. And yet, you enter a place with history. You enter a place that has a long story before you got there. And let's be honest, God was there too before we got there. You know, and sometimes you walk into troubled waters. Speaking of wading the water. For example, when I went to Providence Baptist Church in Charlotte many years ago, my immediate predecessor had been fired. And I had some very bitter choir members I had to build relationships with, and some of you have been through that. So, how do we leave well? How do we begin well? We're going to have some conversation with three esteemed colleagues today about this. So, I'd like for you to just start by tell us your name, where you are now, and maybe the church that you have recently left from. Just give us some context.
I'm Emily Floyd, and I am newly appointed at First Baptist Church of Asheville, and I come from Shallowford Presbyterian Church in Atlanta.
We'll do this. Go around. Can we do it?
Can you?
Yeah. We got the. Ooh, maybe not.
We'll
maybe
see.
not. Maybe.
We might not even get it this way. We'll see.
There's more than one way to do this.
Hi. Carrie Cannon, currently the Director of Music at Highland Park United Methodist Church in Dallas. Previously at South Main Baptist Church in Houston, Texas.
Ryan Jones, currently Director of Traditional Worship at Brentwood United Methodist, and I come from St. Luke's United Methodist in Houston as well.
All right. Sorry, this is a little awkward.
I know, it's good, great.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. So let's think about context. I think it's really important to think contextually when we think about walking into a new place. So we're going to focus first on entering or new beginnings. And I want you to tell us, each of you, tell us a little bit more about the congregational or even music ministry system in which you're now planted, all right? And tell us about how you read the landscape when you're walking into this new space. And without getting too personal or too many details, because let's admit it, all of our circles are pretty tight, you know, and the circles overlap in so many ways. I think it's always interesting to think a little bit about your predecessor, especially the length of their tenure in a place. And, you know, without getting into too much detail again, was their departure natural? just, they move to another post, they retire, or was it sudden and severe, a termination perhaps? So talk to us a little bit about that. We'll start with Emily again.
So at First Baptist Asheville, there is a thriving adult choir, and there was a year of interim before I came on, and that was a successful time, but as you can imagine, many people fell away. And so I'm in week number 5, and people are coming back, which feels great. There are a lot of good resources in the adult choir. Just the voices and their background I feel very blessed. There was a 200-member children and youth choir that was done as a community choir. And youth choir is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that is a choir now of 0 because it was not reconvened after the pandemic. So that is before me to start from scratch, and I do a lot of talking about youth choir and teaching about youth choir around, and so I suddenly find myself in a position that many of my friends have been in when you have to build it from scratch. So Clark and Karen Sorrells were at First Baptist for 26 years, maybe a little longer, since the late 90s, and raised many, many great singers who've gone on to be church musicians or professional singers or professional musicians. And the building that I see, the building up of music ministry, was incredible. Before that, Charles Crocker was there, and I think they televised their services starting in the 80s. And there was an incredible choral legacy there before. So I've moved into kind of a musical dynasty, is what I'm told. I've also hopping denominations, which I think is interesting, and I believe all 3 of us have hopped denominations.
He's the same.
Yeah.
Oh, same.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, Methodist to Methodist. So anyway, that has been interesting as well.
Yes, interesting. My 2 recent transitions, moving into South Maine, 9, almost 10 years, or however many years ago, was a glorious transition in that regard in terms of professionally. And I'm looking at Adam Cagliano, who's there now. My predecessor, likened to yours, 20 plus years, and his predecessor 20 or 30, 30 plus years. So when I arrived then, they were like the next, literally they said, you were the next era of music ministry here. I was like, what? I lasted 9, right about that time, just under right on 9 years. But that transition was healthy, beautiful, glorious, and affirming. My current situation into Highland Park UMC was very different. That was, my predecessor was a different departure. A way to say it, I guess you could say, voted himself off the island, so to speak. Just some unfortunate turn of events. And so there have been some things to work through with that in my year. Everything from budget to relationally to just pastorally, just a little bit of pain. I would also tell you that at Highland Park, there's a long legacy 10 some odd years ago of a gentleman by the name of David Davidson. I mean, many of you will know that name and that man who was glorious and beloved. And David came to Highland Park UMC, bringing the Dallas Symphony chorus members, bringing Bradley Welch, wonderful organist, and just a great reputation of high worship, just great worship and intensity and just effective and glorious worship. And tragically died of cancer. And the choir just really was hit by that. And I tell you that because I've seen, as I look back at the church, they're still grieving that. There have been a lot of, it's been a revolving door of directors at Highland Park. And so when I arrived into a difficult transition of a most previous director and a legacy, a history of a lot of transition. And you're looking at these sweet folks in the choir, and they're just like, they're just wanting someone to stick it, just to be in the trenches with them, just to stick with us and love on us and care and challenge us. So my first year has been sort of leaning into that. But I've also gotten the sense that I also need to start challenging them musically. So I was kind of focused pastorally on the ensemble, which is lovely and wonderful. Here's my cell number, visiting, doing all the things. now I'm realizing, they also want to be musically challenged. That was a group that was used to that caliber of music. So I'm going to focus this next year a little bit less on the administrative demands and pastoral touches and digging into scores, doing a little bit of what we did today, and really being prepared at the highest level for my rehearsals. It was a bit of a fire hose at a new position, administratively, and we will talk later, but I jumped ship from Baptist to Methodist. So swallowing that pill has been interesting, to say the least. And to put that plainly, I'm accustomed to the collegial team, the Baptist, how Baptists see our position as minister and pastor, how I'm involved. Now, I will say Highland Park has been very gracious in my involvement in worship planning. A lot of Methodist churches, that isn't the case, but they have given me some free rein there to be creative in worship, which has been lovely. But then there's also moments where stay in your lane. But now I have a team that I manage below me, and I have a couple of directors above me. I've never been in there before. Last time I was there, I was a staff sergeant in the military. So I'm having to navigate and understand how decisions get made, and that has been exhausting. But anyway, so that's a lot, but
That's all right, yeah.
I was raised Southern Baptist, so. Yeah, there you go. I transitioned a little earlier than you. We have a joke at Brentwood. They say Methodists are just Baptists who've learned to read. They say that from the pulpit, no joke. So.
It's actually a line in the book, "A river runs through it." I don't know if it's original.
But the line is Methodist, or Presbyterians are Methodists that can read.
Yeah.
Is that the line?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So we're out.
Danny
We're out of
knows.
it. Yeah, we're done.
We're
On
out.
we go.
My transition to St. Luke's at Houston was fantastic. That was very easy. I worked with Sid Davis very closely, and so coming alongside him, that's a large department there, and there was a lot of creative autonomy and just a lot of relation building, I would say. The transition to Brentwood, I more or less align with Carrie very closely in the situation that you kind of inherited. We both lean on each other, I think, occasionally, just because it's very similar. And for those of you who know that Brentwood has a long history. It's a 175-year-old church. It's large, and big ships take a long time to move and to affect change. And they've had Mark Acker, they had David Keith, and then after that, there's been a very long transitory period, and that's been, I think, particularly for the chancel choir, I would say, that's been a loss of identity, I think, for them, a smidge, and I think that the unique situation of Brentwood is that I think in many of our churches that the chancel is typically the cornerstone, I would say, of the church, because it's filled with so many different veins of connective tissue between all the other aspects of the church. They kind of find themselves there at your rehearsal on a Wednesday or Tuesday or whenever you rehearse. And so my focus coming in for this year with the chancel, very similar. They've kind of had a revolving door since the David Keith time, and that's for various reasons. But James Wells directs our youth and children, and he's fantastic. He's a great work colleague. He filled that gap for a few years, and then was just about burnt out because of the requirements. And so then Mark Edwards came in and interimed for, I think, it was only supposed to be 6 months. And then COVID hit, and then the search went on for a long time, apparently much longer than they expected. And so this actually happened, I was not planning on leaving St. Luke's, but just they happened to reach out, and it happened very quickly and very randomly. So somehow my wife and myself found ourselves in Nashville between the new year, a year ago. So I've just now come on my first full cycle with the church, and I would say it's different because the structural layout for the worship and arts department, it's it's I always use the term centralized versus decentralized, and there's corporate memory, I think, is more preserved when it's a little more decentralized, because if one person leaves that has all the keys to the kingdom, then all of a sudden, how do we do this? And so I do think that's a positive. However, I think it creates challenges. And also, yes, you all know this, when you go to a new place, it's at some point, you get your fingers pinched by the cogs because didn't you know that you were supposed to know? One of those things. And that, I would say, is probably one of Brentwood's greatest strengths, but also one of its greatest challenges, because there's a lot of memory, but it's only with people who've been there long enough. And so there's been a change just generally in the church of new staff coming on board, and the onboarding process and whatnot, and all the assumptions of didn't you know that you knew, that makes life a little bit not treacherous, but it makes it a little difficult to affect change. But all that saying, we'll talk more about this, but this year has been more of shoring up and just showing up for them, I think, and reiterating that it matters, and so in helping them to find their new identity and what that looks like. So, but we can talk more about that later.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all. Sorry again.
So let's stay with this just for another moment, and actually I'm going to just pass the microphone back to Ryan, and we can come this way and look at this through the twin lens of, on the one hand, the personal. What, in the face of the, let's call it stress, and stress can be good stress or bad stress. I think we all know that, but the stress of going to a new place. How do you, let's use the word thriving, since that's everywhere. How do you thrive personally? As you think about, maybe the first 100 days or the first year, you're navigating all these things, you're expending incredible amount of physical, psychic, and emotional energy on this. You're having to think about the things and wonder about the things you don't know, because you don't know what you don't know. So talk to us a little bit about how you are working on thriving personally, spiritually, however you want to define that. And then secondly, it seemed, I'll put my fingerprints here. It seems to me that one of the things that we're called to do as leaders is to create a clarity of common purpose. You mentioned the identity word, which I think is so important for congregational systems, but also for music ministries, that we eventually get to the point that together we have some sense of clarity of common purpose, what we are up to in this specific place. Some places we inherit a pretty good clarity, and other places it's foggy, right? So talk a little bit about thriving personally, talk a little bit about as a leader in a new place, how do you begin to move toward clarity of common purpose? And I'm going to send that back to Ryan.
Thriving personally, I think we all can feel like we're on an island unto ourselves. Even if we're the directors, even working with your organist or pianist or whoever else on the team, it's still different. And I think for me personally, I schedule it, I put it on the calendar of weekly calls with other colleagues and other people that are in the trenches doing what we do on a weekly basis. And for me, it's imperative that happens, because I think it's very easy to feel isolated sometimes. Even though you have great people that you work around, the stressors of what we do, I think they're very unique, and the things that we have to always consider at all times, it maintains a level of stress, I think, that if it's helpful to know that there are people beside you that are doing the same thing and maybe can look at it from a different perspective. So I think that's a big thing. Another is, I know we all do this, but identify those people that are the selfless people who are there for the bigger picture. I think you'll find people that get it, that they know I'm a part of something that's so much greater than the sum of its parts, and I'm here with that servant heart, and somebody who is not afraid to have a conversation if they see something. And I think identifying those people who aren't going to just be your yes people, but with love, in love, will have real conversations with you, I think are just so important. And so from that thriving aspect, that's something I tried to identify early on. And that lent itself, at least for me, creating choir officers and a president and vice president. And we have, dinners. It's all about the time spent outside of rehearsal. That's helping to build those relationships, I think. And it's people that have history, that have been there, and have seen where it's been, and are on board with the vision that I'm talking with them about, and they are supportive of that. And so I think that's been a very, very important thing. Obviously, close communication with your pastor, but that's a different type of communication and conversation, right? So I don't want to call it an ivory tower. It's not that, but I do think it's identifying those key stones that you can build your whatever you're building upon, and that'll be your rah-rah cheerleaders, because pushing change or affecting change, I think, has to come from within, not just from the top down, essentially. And I think it happens so much more organically when you have that impetus coming from inside, and that to me is where I like to put most of the focus on. And that's been I found it to be very successful, at least this year. Now, give me another year and we'll see what happens. But what was your second question?
Common purpose.
Common purpose.
Clarity.
Yeah.
Getting to clarity.
I straight up stole this from Carrie this year. I think every year it's important to have a theme for the choir, or whatever organization that you're with. And we were talking, I think, I don't know, July, after we had both kind of been doing it for half a year at the new place and talking about all things. And I said, "What are you doing for your choir thing?" He said, "More than just a choir." And it was one of those. It was the day before the next chancel rehearsal, and I went, "I like that. I'm gonna steal it." So I stole it. And so within that vein,
Royalties.
That's right. I'll pay it. You'll have a check reflected next year. But within that vein, basically everything that we did, it's almost like a mission statement. Think of it like that with any nonprofit, right? And scope and sequence. And so that kind of helps us to focus any creative ideas that the choir might come up with, like not fundraising, but just ministry ideas or anything. So kind of how can we tie that back to we're more than just a choir? And that tied in very much with identity, because they've been revolving. And I will say, to their credit, they've stuck together. And that's because there's a lot of people in there who are former directors, or they're just, they're former musicians, and they've just all buckled down. And I think COVID, and I think for everybody, it's galvanizing. For if you came out the other side, you're probably pretty galvanized at that point. And so, despite the revolving door, they stuck it out. And I think what they're looking for is a reminder of, hey, why do we do this? We've been keeping the ship afloat. Well, now let's actually start paddling in a direction. And I think that having those talks about why do we do what we do, we come to lead and worship. And it's not, I will say this, it's not easy. Music isn't easy. If it was, everybody would do it. And I also, we talk about, you are the minister of worship. People take their cues from you. And it matters if you show up. Brentwood's very unique in the sense that people travel quite a bit randomly. I had a flautist fly back from Florida to make it to orchestra rehearsal on Tuesday night, just because. So there are, basically on the roster, we have X amount, and if they all showed up at the same time, we'd have that. But because people are constantly going and doing, it's one of those things where we go, okay, we have this amount that show up every Sunday, this number, but it's not the same people. And they've been like that. And so that's something that I'm really working on, because it matters if you're there. And I think that is what's important. And I will say this, and I'll close with this. I always depend, and I'm so keen on giving ownership back to the choir. And I always call the chancel, I just keep talking about the chancel, it's a ship. I just happen to be the guy at the steering wheel right now, but there'll be more to come after. And but it's theirs. It's all of us corporately, and really pushing the onus on take ownership in what you're doing. And so, I think that to me is what's the focus right now. And I think it'll always kind of be the focus, and we can layer on things on top of that. But I think that, for me, is the foundation that has to be built there. So.
I would say for me, the hardest part for me, from my personal standpoint, it's been daunting at Highland Park in the sense that the load has been, I'm not used to doing 10 Christmas Eve services. I'm not used to having a Coliseum Easter, I don't know what that is.
Literally.
Literally. So I didn't know that my job as a music director was to having large contracts with sound, audio, staging, lighting, facility, the SMU facility. Like, I'm navigating and managing these things. I'm like, was this my calling? Anyway, that overwhelmingness of that, I realized I needed to care for myself. I was an avid runner and early morning worker outer, especially in Houston. Now Adam's been rolled into that group of guys, I'm proud to hear. And I'm saying to you all, I realize I've not been doing that in Dallas. So that is something that has been missing, that I now know I need to be real. I've talked about it since Christmas, and I've yet to make it to my first. Of course, it's been 20 degrees, but
Excuses.
I've got excuses. But I will say that is something important. Whatever that is for you, I'm realizing in its absence, I needed that this past year, and I didn't have that. And I'm starting to see the wear and tear of that in my body and my spirit. I will also say that my family is imperative and important. I think for me, if I'm sitting and screaming on a Saturday, an hour away from our home at a gymnasium for my daughter after she just blocked a volleyball or got an amazing, she's 6'1", she's amazing. She's so fun to watch. And I can't scream at my son because he plays tennis. And that's the most infuriating thing. It's like, because, but all that is to say, those commutes, the sports, that is such a balm for me. Just to give me a weekend away from the craziness, leaning into Janet, who comes in as a teacher exhausted. Don't know about you guys with COVID, but for me, for my family, we drew in. I think it's important in our ministry. Sometimes I think Doug alluded to in a conversation of bringing work home. And we all talk about that, get out of the car, put it in the car. And I think part of what that looks like is leaning into home. Who's going to cook? Who's going to stop by the store? Who's going to take them where and to tend and do? I don't know what that looks like for you. But look at that as a fueling, refilling, rejuvenating component to our ministry. As opposed to coming in stressed and then dumping on or venting to, or I don't know. I mean, however you manage that, but I think that's important. I've seen leaning into my family has been seems cliche, but it's been a help in keeping my spirit. Central focus, more than a choir. That was the slogan, and it just came in a meeting for my team, for me. How that looks. We sing, we serve was another phrase under that. And in essence, this is a church that's accustomed to Wednesday night, Sunday morning. Wednesday night, Sunday morning. Notes are perfect, things are in tune, Well, everybody shows, that's what we do. It's like just a constant machine. I said, whoa. What if we packed food for one of our partners? Oh, what, really? Yeah. What if we partnered with Cornerstone? Our children's choir always sings in our traditional worship. What if we sent them across the hall to sing for contemporary too? Oh. What if we did something with MLK? The idea all of a sudden is that not just that we sing, but we sing, we serve, which falls under we are what? More than a choir. More than just showing up in notes and rhythms. Digging into what Jeffrey was talking about earlier today. Again, central focus, the ship is going, we're all paddling, and now everything falls into place a bit. Has been helpful. And that's exciting. And I would say, if you're not in a new position, you've been here for 20 years, every year, what's it going to be for you? Take some time away, pull your team away, do whatever it is that's an I love you to your team or your staff, and let's think about what's next year's thing. What's it going to be this year? I'm a Clemson fan. I love Dabo. And so every year, it's like one year it was love. What's the word? What's the hook this year with his team? There was a word. And you turn next year, what's the word going to be next year? What's his next? And there was another one, right? You know, bring your own guts. Who knows what it is, right? But I just would charge you to do that. I think that helps keep the ship moving.
So in my first 90 days, they say that's the honeymoon period, right? I have a friend who worked in HR with Equifax, and he said, Emily, read the book the first 90 days. And so I'm in the process of doing that, just trying to be as intentional as I can during this time. And I was going to say the same thing to you that Carrie just said, that whether or not you're starting over, you can always start over. I don't know if you've been there, that you could have a completely clean slate, but it is nice to think in seasons. And so one of the questions I ask myself, if any of you know the preacher Joanna Adams, one of her catchphrases or one of her mantras is, what time is it? So always asking yourself, what time is it? And I find that encountering the parishioners at First Baptist, they're thinking about what time it is in terms of music ministry, particularly in the choir, and will we have children and youth music again? There are very few children and youth at the church, and no one seems to be alarmed about it but me. I'm like, 911, let's call 911. I've got to get some fresh blood in here. And so I really think that that's one of the reasons that I'm called there, is to bring in people who are not already connected to the congregation. And I'm an empty nester just this year. And I was telling Doug that, one of my go-tos is, talk to people on the playground or talk to people in the stands at the sporting events, or, just connecting with a school community, which is easy for me to do. So I'm going to be getting connected with the school communities. Frankly, I need their students, but I can't come in and just poach. I need to go and make a connection, because that's the right thing to do, is to support our school music programs. So anyway, tangent about that, but I encourage you to look at the book, The First 90 Days. I think it's worthwhile to just imagine what a first 90 days would feel like, even where you already are. Of course, establishing relationships. I think you've already heard relationship building is so important. So I'm having 30-minute coffee times with first music ministry participants, and now that it's been 4 weeks, I'm opening it up to the congregation. And it is very interesting what happens with 30-minute time slots. People are kind of anxious because they don't feel like it's long enough. Yet, if you have something that it sort of focuses them to say what they want to say, rather than just sort of rambling and lots of pleasantries. So I would recommend that to you if you haven't taken the time to do that. I've had to keep some pretty good boundaries of, it's this time because it works for my schedule. Thursday mornings and Thursday evenings is when I do it. And if people are wanting to take me out to dinner and do things, then I just need to limit it to these half-an-hour slots that are here. And some that are before the work hour and some that are after 5 o'clock. But I'm willing to do that for a while, and you could do those in some short bursts, and then stop doing them for a while. So relationship building. I think the idea of nourishing yourself, I'm hearing from my colleagues here, whatever that may be. For me, during the pandemic time, it was cooking food that was full of nutrients. And so I'm noticing I'm not really doing that anymore, and needing to prioritize that. And there are multiple ways that we can nourish ourselves. And so I think that idea of leaning in, what did you lean into in the pandemic time? I think that's all a lesson we probably should have taken from that time that we should carry forward and keep that balance. Another thing I would like to share together is that idea of being vulnerable. I had a moment yesterday where I was speaking to a colleague and just kind of began to cry. I was mortified that happened, but it was grief. It was grief of sort of what I've lost. But there's strength in sharing your story and being vulnerable and reflecting back, but yet also looking forward. So I've been struck by how healthy my new colleagues are, how that they have intentionally kept that dynamic. I'm also struck by how hungry the church is. They're sort of anxious about what is next. So what time is it? Clarity would just be, why do you sing? I think that question is something that I ask a lot. The other thing I would share is open-ended questions. Sometimes I just do in a Google form or in person or in writing. Is there anything you want to tell me? And sometimes the thing that is the most interesting to me is why they sing. And we'll be looking at the Hymn Society mission statement, that it heals brokenness, it builds peace, honors God. So we'll be using that Hymn Society mission statement. I encourage you to look at that if you need another idea of a brainstorm of how to sort of coalesce into a vision that might help you have clarity of purpose.
Wonderful, so rich. I know you could add so much to this, but in order to move us toward the 2 o'clock hour, which is just around the corner, I want us to talk a little bit about leaving. And whether you know it or not, or even though, I guess all of us, maybe if we feel like we lead from the second chair as one book, I saw there's a book on my shelf with that title, you still have an incredible amount of power, especially as you're leaving. This is worth reflecting on, and I'm having to reflect on this these days. And I think the most incredible power is the power to bless. So with that framework, I want to end with thinking a little bit about leaving well. And I'm going to ask 3 questions, but you can choose one or, it doesn't have to be all 3. So these are just things for you to think about as well. Did you think you were able to say goodbye in ways that were good for you and good for the congregation? Is there anything you wish you had done differently? I know there's some things in the past I wish I had done differently about leaving. And do you perceive the choir or music ministry is in a good place to welcome and to bless your successor? So let's take any one of those. We'll start with Emily, and we'll wrap up here just in a minute.
One thing that became very clear, I think clarity on when to leave is a whole nother session, but I'll leave that alone. One thing that I did was took care of myself. And I chose to leave in the month of December before Christmas. And I had, which some people I'm sure thought was horrible. But that was a decision to take care of myself so that I could be fresh and ready and vision for my new thing. I also felt like, Christmas doesn't need me. Jesus was born anyway. I mean, like so many things about Christmas are automatic pilot. I had rehearsed the music. They were in good shape. They had Lynn Brown Rogers as this wonderful conductor that could do the interim time. Anyway, so I would encourage anyone who is thinking about leaving, at some point you do have to take care of yourself. I'll just speak quickly about one thing that was surprising to me, and that was, so mine was sort of situational, that we were going to be empty nesters. My husband got a job as a pastor in North Carolina, and so, of course, I was going to follow. Although I had already discerned it was probably getting close to time anyway. But the thing that was surprising, even though my folks knew I would probably be moving soon, was just sort of how even some of the people I was closest to began to, out of self-protection, sort of loosen those ties. And I think all of us are sort of attuned to chemistry, body language, relationships that are within the people whom we serve. And so that was sort of difficult, but at one point I realized that that was self-protection and a way that people were coping, and I had already probably done that anyway. As I'm, it's hard to interview in a way that feels like you have integrity. That's a challenge. So I was surprised by that, but I think it's pretty natural.
I was called in September. October was the interview up. I don't know how in the world I interviewed and did a weekend at Dallas and it didn't get to Houston, but somehow it didn't. I don't know. It was a big choir. I was surprised. Shows you how much Houston and Dallasites hate each other. Anyway.
Sorry for laughing too loud.
No, that was yes, he knows. Steve, my pastor, was about to fly to Scotland for something, and it was during the time that I knew eventually I would be going to Dallas. I chose to my boss that I wanted to have a conversation of I'm about to, as opposed to I just did. I would charge you not to be too worried about your colleagues. And don't tiptoe around things. Cut right to it. That's the most faithful, trusting, and respectful thing you can do. He was and handled it like he would, just like a champ. And he said, okay, well let me, because we think it's going to rock the world, and it's not. I mean, it's hard to hear, but we didn't birth the baby Jesus. Yeah. I also would have my children in this mix. They were at the time 13 and 15, and mature enough emotionally that we felt like I didn't want to sit them on the couch and say, kids, we're going to Dallas. And so we wrapped them in toward the last quarter of that process emotionally, and I would say they supported me in many ways, and especially my 13-year-old a couple of times. That surprised me. I was like, wow, God, I needed that. So I think that was important in my transition out. I did do Christmas Eve. There were moments where I maybe thought I shouldn't have.
Right or wrong. Yeah.
Congregation knew, oh golly, I can't remember, somewhere end of October 1st, or November. We were in November, I think, when I announced. So saw them through right before Advent. So I saw them through Advent and Christmas Eve. And then I was at Dallas on January the 3rd. I did not take Steve Wells' advice like I should have when I came to South Main, and that was I did not give myself a sabbatical time between the two positions. I could have put my foot down at Highland Park, but it's like, we got to go. We're big, it's a big machine. We need you now. And I should have. And so I regretted that. So do that. Give yourself some time, whatever it looks like, with your family, yourself, to give space to breathe before you jump in. And when you think about it, inhaling and exhaling, there's that moment of pause naturally in our bodies of just that, or you pull the trigger when you're shooting, right? That moment of pause before the next act. And so I just think that's something important in that regard. Is that all that you asked?
That's great.
He's like, no more, Kerry.
Oh, gosh. I was very similar.
Yeah, we were doing the same time,
We were literally doing it at the same time.
both in the U-Haul.
It takes a long time to sell a house, just as an extra aside. That's just one other part of the cog in that whole thing. I came to Sid after our mutual friend started putting his fingers in cookie jars and doing things. So, and I told him, I said, this is going on, here's where I'm at. And it was literally just kind of one of those conversations. It was very much, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't think we do anybody any favors by not being truthful to, quote, save their feelings. I think that's might be a short-term feel-good, but in the long term, I think that's going to not do any favors for your colleagues. So, but I came to him and I said, this opportunity has presented itself. I want to explore it. That's kind of how I approached it. And he said, okay. He was super supportive. And so basically I let both the choirs and the church know around November. And so I finished out through Christmas as well. And actually it was a good choice for me and my wife. with a caveat of my wife works for Rice University in Houston, but we live in Nashville. So she works remotely, and she still flies back probably every month, once a month. And so it's interesting. My pastor, one of our pastors, we were talking before I left, and she said, "Your heart moves last." And I went, interesting. And fast forward about 6 months into being in Nashville, I went, oh, I get it. And one of those references, because we've had multiple choir members come and stay with us and visit us from Houston, multiple church people, and we have FaceTime calls with a lot of them. And it's not, I would say love isn't divisive, it's multiplicative. It's additive. And I think it's not, you shouldn't feel guilty. You're adding to your family. And I think for us and for my wife and myself, that was because you come alongside these people and do life with them for years, and it's not easy leaving, and you can sometimes feel not imposter syndrome, but you feel like you've cheated on them somehow, but no, you still love them just the same. It's just you've added to your family. So yeah, that was important for us, and we did take 3 weeks of cadence between January. I started at the 18th of January, so I laughed at him while we were driving. So.
Yes. Yeah, and I also would say that what was I going to say? I just had that moment Jeffrey had the earlier today. Gosh, let's see how old I am. No, you were just saying something that I think was going to be very important, and I just lost it. My brain is going a million miles a minute. I remember what it was. Remind your congregation, this is a call beyond them. Everyone in this room was called to ministry beyond a church. You were called vocationally to what we do. And it's that reminder we are living into a larger narrative and dialogue that included a Providence Baptist Church following him, included a South Main following Thomas, and included Highland Park now for me. But I am living into a larger call. I think that was helpful for the church that you're at leaving to go, okay, hard to hear, but we get it. Anyway.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I just want to end with this. I was sitting at my desk at Providence Baptist Church in Charlotte, had already made the decision to go to Wilshire in 2004, and in the mail there arrived a card. And I opened this card in an envelope sitting at my desk, and it was a note from Bill James, who was the minister of music at Wilshire Baptist Church for 33 years. And Bill's note said, "Welcome to Wilshire. I hope you're going to love these people as much as I love these people." And the sense of blessing and invitation to be part of that legacy was such a gift before I had even arrived. And it reminds me of that many of our presidents have often, there's a tradition of leaving a note for the successor. I think there's a beautiful note out there from George, number 43, to Barack Obama as one example. George H.W. Bush was very famous for his note writing. And that's a beautiful tradition we might consider as a way of blessing and having a good relationship. And lastly, I'll say, yes, Carrie followed me at...
You didn't send me a letter, though.
I didn't send you a letter.
No letter. I didn't know.
Thanks for that, Carrie. As one of my sister's kids says, shut and you know the rest of it. My relationship to Carrie has been, I think, in my experience, the most unique in terms of collegiality between a person who followed me. I'm not sure how we did that, but it has been a beautiful thing. And I would encourage you, if there's any way you can, to bless your successor and bless your predecessor. And let's thank our panel, please. Thank you all. Wonderful.